when he gets that information, he does the math, he uses scale lines, and he says he draws a line with real data, and it crosses into this. Hi you guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and a lot of times on this channel we walk through books together. We have gone through Ask Not, about the Kennedys and the women they destroyed. We are currently going through 3 different books. We are on Sundays going through Melania's book, titled Melania. It's her new autobiography that just came out this month. So we are working through that. On Wednesdays, we are going through Leo D'Amour's book, Chappaquiddick, which is an intense, all the way in investigation, fact by fact by fact, about the situation that happened in 1969 on Chappaquiddick Island with Ted Kennedy that resulted in the death of Mary Jo Kopechne in his vehicle. On Fridays right now, we are going through Radium Girls, a book by Kate Moore that goes into a group of young ladies in the 1920s who worked painting radium onto watch dials and airplane dials and mechanisms for World War I without actually knowing that the method that they were using was harming their physical body, and the repercussions that followed that led to workplace safety regulations that now are in place. So those are the 3 books we're doing right now. I would love for you to join us for any of those, but today I actually randomly, I've had a beast of a week, and so when a friend sent me a documentary recommendation, I took her up on it. I just sat back and watched the documentary. Not like I had planned to do that today, but once I started it, I went ahead and just started jotting down some notes because I thought it would be really fun to talk through with you guys, similar to what we did recently for the documentary, The Assassination and Mrs. Payne, which looked into the JFK assassination and all the ways that Ruth Payne played a pivotal role in evidence, testimony, and our ongoing view of Lee Harvey Oswald. So if you're interested in that, I'd refer you back to that one. The links for all of these will be in the description below, and you can also just go to my channel page to find any of those. They each have their own playlist, so it should be relatively easy to find. But this documentary is called JFK, The Smoking Gun, and it was done in 2013. It's only an hour and 26 minutes. I'm just going to kind of try to talk through the whole thing here in this one video. So if you're interested in getting a quick overview of the documentary, that's what this video is designed to do, as well as to elicit your commentary, maybe information you have, books you've read, things that either tear apart what this documentary says, or things you've read, heard, observed, testimonies that might support this view. I will say this documentary, unlike the other one that we did, the Ruth Payne documentary really was more like looking into and investigating the role of Ruth Payne and trying to make sense of it and leaving the reader, leaving the viewer to decide for themselves what they think about it. This documentary has very much one single point of view. And the documentary, like many of these, starts out with just the simple facts of the assassination. And I like the way that he did it because he walks through and he says, these are the things that every theory agrees on. And so he laid out the basics of the assassination, the timeline. For example, Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. We all know that for sure, no matter where you fall on any of it, whether or not they had a pre-existing relationship, whether or not they were both CIA, whether or not they were both acting independently, whatever you believe about that, the fact that Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald on X date is a fact. So he starts out with just all the basic known facts, which was great. And he references the Warren Commission, which, if you're not familiar, the Warren Commission basic outcome it was a government appointed commission that took about a year, maybe a little longer, to go through, I believe, over 500 witnesses, hours and hours, of course, hundreds and thousands of hours of collective manpower were used to produce a really thick report called the Warren Report. And the essential view that they came to after reviewing the testimony was that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman, that there were 3 shots, one of which was nothing. And so they had to do 2 things with 2 shots. The first one would have gone through the throat, hit Governor Connally. Governor Connally was in a jump seat, so he was further down. It went all the way through him. That's the one that's called the magic bullet. And then the third one would have been the fatal headshot. So that's the way that they laid out the evidence and their review of it. It references, of course, this documentary goes into the fact that most Americans still do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman, which they don't, and they basically never did. Government trust by the people plummeted after the Warren Commission and has continued to fall. And the number of people who believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the lone gunman continues to hover around 70-78%. It's a huge portion of people that do not buy the Warren Commission report. So they introduce a man named Colin McLaren. He's an Australian man, and here's the quote about him. No other career detective had undertaken a cold case investigation of all the evidence about the JFK assassination. So that's his goal, that's his ambition as he goes in, and we see him walking around Dealey Plaza. He takes the approach of solving a case from the inside, and he describes the Bend, which I actually just went to Dealey Plaza last weekend with my husband, and I did a little short. You can look for that on my channel where I actually, like, over my shoulder, let you see vehicles doing the bend in the road that had to be done, where basically you have to come to an almost stop and then turn greater than 90-degree turn to get onto Elm Street, which was the road that he was shot on. But not only that, from the 6th floor depository, the actual road itself is flat, and then right at that part where it bends, it starts a downward trajectory. And so the shot from the book depository is quite an interesting shot. It's a difficult shot. And of course, he points out, which I did it also in that same little walk around at Dealey Plaza, that there's a long stretch on Houston Street where their cars were aimed directly at the school book depository. And so he says that even though 10 to 12 witnesses said that they spotted a shooter in the window of the 6th floor depository, that the Secret Service all somehow missed the gun in the window. And he goes up, he's looking at Lee Harvey Oswald's sniper nest and boxes and saying, wow, you know, when you really think about this shot, it's a very tiny space. He would have been filled with nerves, etc. He takes us back to an investigation that was done, I believe, in the 60s, shortly after the assassination, where CBS, the news station, set up a setting out in like a field where they did a tower that someone had to shoot from, and then they had a moving, like a little roller coaster thing that they built with a man's profile in the spot that Kennedy would have been. And it was built to the right trajectory and at the right specifications. And this test that they did, they had 3 or 5 different men with great marksmanship who took the shots. And afterwards, even though most of them struggled to get the shots off, after that investigation, because of one of the men, CBS decided, yeah, it's plausible that you could get off the 3 shots in, I believe, 5.7 seconds, or whatever the statistic is for Lee Harvey Oswald's alleged shots. So one of the men, the one who did the best in this test, was named Howard Donahue, and he is going to become a focus of this entire documentary. He was a ballistic expert who did the gunshots, but he only got his shots off on his 3rd try. After, practicing one right after the other, they would practice, take their shots, and then someone else would go, and then someone else would take their shots, and like that. And then his 3rd round was when he was able to do it in that length of time. And so after participating in the test, he really began to doubt that someone who was in a high stress situation with that particular rifle, it was an old, apparently World War II rifle. I know it's a Mannlicher Carcano, but I'm not a weapons expert. I don't know what these things are, but he described it as a pretty rattly World War II era gun, not something that was up to snuff in 1963. So he doubted that it could have been done, and he begins a decades-long digging expedition of just trying to understand more and more about the assassination. He spends lots of time reading the Warren Commission. He gives articles and interviews, and at some point, Bonner Menninger, who's an author, who's also referred to many times in this documentary. I think he might actually be the maker of the documentary. I'm not entirely sure about that. But he gets in contact with Donahue because he appreciates Donahue's analysis of the magic bullet. He notes that Donahue actually is the one who, when people had doubts about the magic bullet, Donahue was actually the one who did the research and figured out that what I just described, that the jump seat where Kennedy and Jackie were higher up, and then there was a smaller seat down below, and so LBJ and Lady Bird were actually lower than John and Jackie, and they were also a little closer together. And so some of the models that people were working with were like, yeah, the bullet had to go like this, and then up, and then down, and then turn. But actually, when he was the one who, projected this big image of the Zapruder film, which I guess would have been after, 1975, I believe was when Geraldo showed that for the first time to the American people. But he projects it up, and then he's able to see the position that LBJ was in. Not LBJ. I think I said that a moment ago. Not LBJ and Lady Bird. It was Governor Connolly and his wife, Nellie. Scratch that last thing. You guys know who I mean. Anyway, so when Governor Connolly was turned like this, and Nellie is there beside him, he's turned, and that's why the angle of the bullet was actually right. And he was the first one, apparently, to prove that. And so Bonner Menninger was impressed with Donahue's analysis and said that because of his adjustment, he actually proved that the Warren Commission was right in that particular instance, that the magic bullet could have made that trajectory. He also was the one who went and looked at the evidence, and he notes, even though there's one angle that's always shown of the magic bullet where, if I showed you this pin and it looks like a pin, but then from this angle, the bullet is actually like almost an oval shape. So it is definitely not a pristine bullet. There's also like a gouge out of part of it. So it's not a pristine bullet. And so all that to say that Donahue is actually a fair observer. He is not some sort of quack, conspiracy theorist trying to just, pull a thread out every which way. He actually was one of the ones who, in this case, reinforced an aspect of the Warren Commission. But then the documentary goes into that Governor Connolly did not believe that it was the first shot that got the magic bullet, and that he thought it was the second shot that did that trajectory. And this is why the Warren Commission, he was so firm about it. He gave interviews. He was adamant. And I think Nellie was too. And I think Nellie actually thought there had been more bullets even than that. But Governor Connally for sure did not believe that it was the first bullet. And so because of that, one bullet had hit the pavement, and they had to do their entire theory with just 2 remaining bullets, because the idea was that 3 shell casings had been found up in the 6th floor depository. And so they had 3 to work with. 1 was gone, so now they're down to 2. So they got the magic bullet and the headshot. Roy Kellerman, who was in the presidential limo, he is in the front seat of Kennedy, and then Connally and his wife are here. He distinctly remembers, and he gives testimony, that he hears Kennedy say, "My God, I'm hit." And I believe it's Howard Donahue, which is the ballistic expert we've been talking about. I believe he's the one who surmised that if Governor Connally had been right, that it was not the first bullet, then he thought that if the first bullet hit the pavement, as one woman testified, she said she saw a flash down at the curb. And so if that bullet hit the pavement, then a fragment perhaps could have hit Kennedy. And that's when he could have spoken, "My God, I'm hit." Because he said the second bullet went through his throat and he wouldn't have been able to speak, was his assessment. So he uses that to tell us that that's part of his theorizing. So then we are taken to the autopsy. And throughout this documentary, they do a good job of trying to acclimate us to the different personalities involved. He describes a huge defect on the right side of the skull. And he says that when he saw it in the autopsy, that there were 30 to 40 bullet particle fragments in Kennedy's brain. And so then they explain from the perspective of a ballistics expert that, and they did a great job, they actually used a cantaloupe to help visualize this. And so I'm going to try to describe it for you guys. One of the bullets that was from the rifle shot, which would have potentially been Lee Harvey Oswald's weapon. When it goes through the cantaloupe, it's a clean through. There is a hole on this side, there is a hole on the other side. You can see straight through the cantaloupe, and the exit hole is not remarkably different from the entrance hole. But the frangible bullet is like an explosion. It is trained to, when it hits, it said it traveled a little ways and then began exploding like this. And so they describe the difference between those two and say the one, which is the one that we've just talked about, the magic bullet, had the capacity to go through and then through Governor Connally's, I believe it's his back, shatters one of his ribs, just about like 4 inches of rib, it says, were injured. And then it goes out through his wrist and into his thigh and embeds there. And that's actually possible with one of those bullets. But that a frangible bullet cannot do that. You get a tiny entrance wound, but then a massive explosion, which when they did that with the cantaloupe, that is indeed what it was. I mean, it went in and then the whole thing just busts open like this. And so very visually helpful, even though it's a terrifying thing to consider that happening to our president. He makes the case that you cannot fire these 2 completely different bullets, and he holds them up in their different sizes from the same weapon. And that if you have 2 different weapons and 2 different kinds of ammo, then you have a second shooter that you have to account for. And up till now, I think a lot of conspiracy theorists would go, oh, great, cool, well, awesome, good information here. I'm just listening to all this and thinking, number one, I'm not of the view that we will for sure ever know the facts. Although I do hold out hope that eventually we could have a government that would be brave enough to tell us the truth. And if so, I would welcome that. And I would be very grateful for that and press for increasing openness. I believe government is way too big, way too intrusive on our lives, has way too much capacity to keep things back from us and obscure the truth and even alter what we believe is true. And so I am for complete transparency where possible. I recognize that sometimes in foreign policy or intelligence, there might be times where, you have to keep those things carefully guarded. However, that idea has been exploited far beyond what ought to be. That said, let's get back to the documentary. So Howard Donahue makes the case, number one, that the entry wound had to be, the one that's described in the autopsy back here, had to be from a smaller frangible bullet that is not the same measurements and it cannot be the same bullet. And then number two, that the trajectory is not right for that bullet to be from Oswald's gun. So neither can you have that ammo coming from that same gun, but you also cannot have that trajectory. And so at this point, I don't know if you're feeling like this, but I actually went back and I watched the Zapruder film for myself. And the first one that I watched was the restored version, which has all the color and it's got a woman in a bright orange dress behind him and all of that. And I actually slowed it down. You can do this on YouTube, go to 25% playback speed. And I was pausing and looking, trying to observe what they're saying, because the point that he was making is that if you look at the Zapruder film and you look at the way the head explodes, that it is an explosion that happens this way. And then the head falls back like this, but that it's a shot. And if it's a frangible, then his point is it would be traveling from the back of the head to here and then explode. So I go back to watch the Zapruder film, number one, to see which way visually I think the explosion is happening. Is it happening towards the front or towards the back? The second thing that I was observing was what was his body position? Because just like with Connolly, just like we just talked about with the magic bullet, if Connolly is sitting up at the same level as Kennedy and he's seated straight, then that bullet makes no sense. But when you turn him like this, which he was, and you put him lower, then the trajectory of the bullet makes sense. So I was watching the film for those two things. Where is the puff going? And also, what is his body position? And from what I could tell, so his body, he comes up like this, and Jackie's starting to turn towards him. People are turning around, and then he's leaning like this, and Jackie leans in, which actually watching it at that 25% speed for me was like, oh my goodness, the bullet's about to hit her. That's how I felt, was like, oh, if it goes much further, and I know it's not, but that's the timing. She's leaning in to be with him. And then there is a puff that looks like it comes this way, which would, from their description, from what they're telling me, I'm no ballistics expert. I'm going off of their word, and he is a ballistics expert who was called on by CBS and also solved this problem of the Warren Commission. So he has some credibility in my eyes. I could see what he's talking about, that the spray is here, but also that because of where the entry wound is and because of where the spray is, you can't get it to be from back here. That doesn't make sense. It has to be a lower shot. And so that's hard. It says he said it's a much lower angle. This is Howard Donahue. He said it's impossible that it could have been Lee Harvey Oswald in the 6th floor book depository, that it just doesn't work. And he said, so he starts looking, and he says, I just thought it has to be behind and to the left of President Kennedy. He actually, again, has the thing projected, and he's looking at exact mathematical data to try to discover, because he knows ballistically that that's how you solve these kinds of crimes. And so he notes, those of you who have studied the Kennedy assassination know that there are differences between what the Dallas doctors describe as having seen in the ER for the hour or so that they were working on him versus what was done in the Bethesda autopsy, and then also that apparently there were edits and alterations made even after that. And that one of the things that was done was the changing of the entrance wound location, that it was actually, I believe, several inches different than what was drawn. When he gets that information, he does the math. He uses scale lines, and he says he draws a line with real data, and it crosses the Secret Service car directly behind Kennedy. If you can see where this is going, here we go. He notes that 10 witnesses on the ground that were interviewed that day smelled gunpowder. And I immediately went to, I remember, because I've listened to, there's a database online now where you can listen to real-time interviews that were done of eyewitnesses in the 1960s. There's a ton of them online, and you can just listen. And one day I did this probably a couple months ago. And what struck me at that time was that a number of them, 15, 20, in the short period of time that I spent just clicking through and clicking on ones that were of interest to me, I want to say at least 15 of them described a puff of cloud of gunpowder hanging in the air. And they described it under those trees, if you remember that. And so in my mind, at the grassy knoll, the trees in the grassy knoll. And so in my mind, when I heard this, that 10 witnesses smelled gunpowder, I'm like, are they conflating those witnesses that said it hung under the, trees with now this? Because to me, that would be bad handling of data, right? But no, they talk about street level witnesses, and they actually, I love how the documentary does this. They actually have little figures standing in the model, and they identify where the person was, like whether they were in the actual motorcade or standing on the side. And one of them was a policeman. His quote was that a couple minutes later, he smelled gunpowder. Another one was a woman in the mayor's car, 4 cars behind Kennedy's. She says that one of her distinct memories of the day is the smell of gunpowder. And she gave other testimony. She gave a testimony to the Warren Commission. And then he tells us that, just so you know, the wind that day was blowing toward Lee Harvey Oswald. So you would not get 6 floors up. The wind would have been blowing back toward the buildings, back toward downtown Dallas, not bringing gunpowder down 6 floors toward the street, toward Dealey Plaza. So it couldn't have been Lee Harvey's, or the 6th floor, or let's just say the assassin's gunpowder smell coming down, because gunpowder goes with the wind. And so the mayor's wife smelled it 4 cars back. And then Senator Yarborough, who I had heard of, actually, he's a famous senator outside of this assassination. He counted 3 rifle shots that he heard, and he had served I believe in combat. And so he had ballistics familiarity. And he was confused that day about how he could smell gunpowder. His exact quote was, "You don't smell gunpowder unless you're upwind of it." And so he gave that testimony to the Warren Commission, I believe, or that was his testimony, yes, to the Warren Commission. He said, "You don't smell gunpowder unless you're upwind of it." Now, I don't know if he was, trying to communicate his concerns, but upwind, if you're coming down, you guys are not maybe familiar with Dealey Plaza, but if you're coming down Elm Street, then the only things you could be upwind of would be the bridge, which is straight ahead, and there were witnesses there. And it seems that there's no indication of actual shots coming from the bridge. There is the grassy knoll and tree area, which there is reports of puffs of smoke and suspicious activity there, and lots of people ran in that direction after the assassination. There is the book depository back here. Some people have mentioned the Daltex building or the records building being potential sites of assassins, but those would have been behind. Any of those buildings would have been behind and downwind from the 6th floor depository shots. So the only things that are upwind and then you have the left side of the across from the grassy knoll, which I don't believe I've ever heard of anyone saying that shots came from this area, but I'm not sure about that. But all you have are these options if you're going to say we were upwind. The wind, if it's blowing from this direction, you can only bring the gunpowder smell from there. So Yarborough, who's familiar with weaponry, he's the one who said that, which is interesting. And he was a senator and he was testifying. So that holds some weight to me. The initial guy, let's see, Colin McLaren, that we started with, the investigator, he says that the best witnesses that he has found in cases are the day of, before it can be corrupted. He says the very best witnesses you can have for a situation are immediately after it happened and someone else writing down exactly what they say. He says, if you can get your hands on that, often that the witnesses themselves will tell you what happened, and you just have to be able to sort through it and see it. That's his assessment as an investigator. And so then we go through a series of witnesses. Hugh Betzner says that he saw a gun at the scene. He says he saw a man raise up and fall back. Senator Yarborough, the one we were just talking about, said he saw a Secret Service agent pull out an automatic weapon. And there's an article about this that I might like to read with you guys. It's from the Chicago Sun-Times the very next day after the assassination. So I think it would be fascinating to read his account, because he was an observer who was in the motorcade and had that firsthand information. Now, he did not see the assassination. He said they could tell that there was commotion and chaos happening in Kennedy's car, but that they did not know what had happened until they got to the hospital. At the Warren Commission, he says that one Secret Service agent gave a testimony to the Warren Commission, and their testimony was that they saw a weapon in the car and thought that he had shot it. That was one Secret Service agent. We're not given the name of who that was. And then we are told that the person who was in that rear seat, which is where the line had been drawn to, who was the one that held the automatic rifle, was named George Hickey. They tell us that the AR-15, which is what he had in the car, fires frangibles, which is the same kind of weapon that makes the cantaloupe go like this, right? All in all, they point to 11 witnesses that say that there was a gun in the hand. So they have 11 witnesses who are able to say, this is what we saw. There's a Baltimore Sun article that he did at this point. Once he got to this level of information where he realized there have to be two different kinds of weapons, it has to be at a much lower angle. He finds the entrance wound location, draws the line, figures out that this is where it is, and then he's seeing all this evidence that people gave at the time that said, yeah, we smelled gunpowder, and all these witnesses who saw a Secret Service agent with gun in hand while in Dealey Plaza. Then he goes to the Baltimore Sun, which this is another article we could read together, but it's with Howard Donahue, and he gave a 2-part article in the spring of 1977 disclosing this much of the information. The documentary then takes us to Parkland Hospital, which is of course where the motorcade went immediately after the following. We're told that 6 minutes was how long it took from the shooting to them arriving at the hospital. It is just right close to Dealey Plaza. Pretty soon we see the newsreels of the president is dead. And Dr. Earl Rose was the medical examiner. He fights hard against the Secret Service, saying that the body cannot leave Texas without an autopsy, that it's illegal to do so, that he cannot permit the transfer of the body. And the Secret Service agent, Roy Kellerman, the one who was in that front of that vehicle, says the body must go back. We're going back. Special circumstances apply here. This is the president. We're taking him. Earl Rose is insistent, you cannot do that. That's in violation of the law. They do it anyway. Basically say, stop us, we're doing this. And so they leave without an autopsy. No autopsy was done in Dallas. And then he walks us through, which many of us know, but the idea that all the Secret Service agents had been up late the night before, drinking and carousing, many of them reportedly until 5 a.m. Kennedy got up pretty early for a breakfast in Fort Worth, I believe, and then they hopped over and flew to Dallas. So it had already been a full day. It had been 3 full days. They had done a blitz of several Texas cities. And so normally, apparently, Hickey was not the one who was in charge of the gun, but his assessment is that perhaps because of those who had been drinking, that Hickey was the one put in that position because others were not as capable in this particular moment. He reminds us that 11 witnesses, 7 of whom were Secret Service agents, saw the machine gun pulled out in Dealey Plaza. And then he points us to Kellerman's testimony before the Warren Commission, which was that the AR-15 was ready to go, that they kept it ready to go in the within reach. Hickey's statement was that it was in the floorboard and that he had to pull it up, cock it, and load it, and then it was ready for use. And his statement was that that did not happen until they were under the bridge and on their way. So that would be after they left Dealey Plaza. His exact statement was that after the last bullet, that he pulled the gun out, got it cocked and loaded. There is one photo of him on the highway with the machine gun. So that's available, but nothing in Dealey Plaza that shows it for sure. But those 11 witnesses say that he did. Well, we're getting towards the end of the documentary, but they take us into the autopsy in Bethesda. And this is where chaos ensues. They say there's more than 30 people in the room, that it is chaotic. We didn't actually know some of this until the 1993 JFK Records Act was passed during Bill Clinton's administration. And so a lot of the records were released at that point. But in 1995, a group tries to get specifically the Secret Service documents. And because of the JFK Records Act, they ought to have been able to do so. When they ask that in 1995, they are informed that Secret Service had unfortunately destroyed all the documents related to that the week before the request was made. So there's no documents about the autopsy from the perspective of the Secret Service. From the evidence, what we can say is that, and what's known through other people's testimonies, that's what we're getting at this point in the documentary, is not the documents of the Secret Service who oversaw the autopsy, and not the records of the 2 FBI witnesses who were there the entire time documenting everything that was being done. None of that is available. What we have are verbal testimonies from some people who have been willing to speak up about the autopsy. And so what we're told is that during the autopsy, they were able to verify that the neat, clean wounds, which for that we're talking about the throat entrance wound here, and the one that was in Connolly's body and on his bed, that those wounds all match the Full Metal Jacket bullet, which was a 6.5 millimeter. Their wounds were about 7 millimeters. And so that matches. All of those were just like that bullet that went straight through. But Hume, who was the examiner who oversaw the autopsy, said that the cerebrum was blown. He said there was tiny radio opaque material that was granular. So his assessment was that it was a frangible. But the x-ray tech who went in and out a couple of different times into the autopsy room described it as a chaotic scene. He said the decibel level was high and you had to actually yell to be heard because there were 30 people. There was different arguments happening. There were groups that were discussing and debating one another about what was actually happening. And so that to be heard, you actually had to yell to make yourself heard. So if you can imagine this room just filled with people, and here's JFK on the slab in the middle. It's a crazy picture. There were photographers there, and it was all film. One of them did the official photos that are seen, but another one was there. He was an assistant, and he said he took well over 100 photos. He took several rolls worth of photos, but that all film that they possessed on their bodies and in their cases and everywhere in their belongings was confiscated, even if it had nothing to do with the Kennedy situation and even if it was unused, the things that they hadn't even shot anything with, that all their film was confiscated and handed over to the Secret Service, and that it stops with Kellerman. Kellerman is the one who collected that from them, signed off on it, and they never saw it again. They never saw those photos. Supposedly they were going to be delivered to the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission does not have any record of those. The X-ray tech that described the scene for us earlier as chaotic, he actually went on to testify that he was asked to falsify an X-ray by taping Full Metal Jacket bullet fragments to the bone. And he did. So, he says to his shame, he did. That's that X-ray tech. And then the way they wrap up the whole thing is that in the book called Mortal Error, which was released in 1992, this man, Bonner Menninger, and the ballistics expert, Howard Donahue, was kind of informing the book, but Menninger was the main author of that book. They published this book in 1992, which names George Hickey as an accidental shooter, that it was unintentional. Their assertion is that in the heat of the moment, he hears they take his own statement that he heard and went to look at the shooter, where the shots were coming from the book depository, and then in the process he grabbed, but because it was already ready to go, as Kellerman described, that actually he got off a shot, and that shot accidentally was what killed the president. I will say, and the final thing that they tell us is that Donahue passed away a year after this, and there was back and forth legal threats from Hickey that he did not sue them immediately, but that 2 years after the book was released, he sued them for, slander. And so the book kind of didn't do very well commercially and ended in legal troubles. But that essentially this author, Menninger, still believes that this is the case, that it was an accidental shooting, that no one is saying he did it on purpose. They're not saying that that there was some sort of larger plan. It was completely an accident. But then that basically law enforcement covered for law enforcement, that they pulled rank, they got his body out of there, they covered their own autopsy, they did what they had to do to control evidence, and that's the picture that was presented. They point the finger at Arlen Specter on the Warren Commission for having been kind of noticeably uncurious about the indications that there might have been a shooter in the vehicle while in Dealey Plaza, that basically no questions were asked, and anytime any witness kind of got anywhere close to that information, that they tried to steer the that he particularly, Arlen Specter, seemed deliberately to try to steer the conversation in a different direction. I haven't read the Warren Commission, although, if I had unlimited time in the world, perhaps I would do so. I don't even know. I do have a book called Inquest, which is like looking at some of the contradictions within the Warren Commission. It's just such a huge volume, the actual Warren Commission, that in fact, there's this man named Penn Jones, who was an early conspiracy theorist that lived right near where I live. And he said that he questioned if even 1,000 people in all of America ever read the entire Warren Commission, that it was just massive and very hard to get your teeth around. So, we do have to rely often on people who have compiled it for us and can tell us what it means. But in review of this documentary, I will say I found Donahue's perspectives on ballistics to be very convincing. I found myself going back to the Zapruder film and really trying to bring fresh eyes to it to see what is, and not what, someone else has told me there is, not what I kind of suspect it might be, but just what is actually happening right here in front of me. And that's why I told y'all I watched it on really slow. Then I went back and watched the original version, and each one I went back and forth and tried to really watch several times to see what direction is the puff happening. And I will say that I found that very convincing. I think that's a very interesting idea, that there were clean wounds on the one bullet and a potentially frangible bullet that caused this unintentional wound. And I do think, we've been talking about this actually in Chappaquiddick in our book, that there are some explanations that make more sense of the circumstance than others. And to me, this idea that there was an accidental shot, that then there was just a need to go ahead and cover for the guy who made a terrible error, that makes sense to me. But that said, I have a couple of questions. One of them is, does the trajectory of that frangible bullet have to travel through the windshield of the vehicle that they were in? Because if so, then I don't know ballistics, but wouldn't that mean that the frangible parts would bust up after going through the bullet? I believe there's a photo, that very one that shows the gun on the highway. I think you can see the entire intact windshield. And so I don't know the trajectory. It's possible that then if he's standing, that maybe it would have just missed. I don't know, but that seems like terrible, terrible luck if that's the way it went. So that's a question that I have after watching it. But it's an interesting documentary. And like I said, it's an hour and a half. And the final thing I'll say is it is free on Amazon right now. So if you're wanting something to watch, it's an interesting documentary. It definitely has some interesting firsthand testimony. And it definitely gave me something different to consider in regard to all of this. I will say, if you are a person who believes that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the shooter, they do take that tack the entire documentary. The way that they talk about it is that it was Lee Harvey Oswald in that 6th floor window and that he's the one who took the shots. But their assessment is that his shots would not have been fatal. and that this accidental shot was. So let me know what you guys think about all of this. Comment back with any evidence you have, any input you have, and I welcome that. You guys have a great day. I love getting to do this with you. Hope you enjoyed it too. Bye.